Okay, so part one, these are the objectives for us tonight. We'll be talking about JSP. We'll define what JSP is, and also we'll differentiate the difference between JSP and Servlet, or sometimes we call that a pure Servlet. We'll look at the architecture of JSP, and we'll compare the both life cycles of JSP and the Servlets. And they look very similar here, you'll see in a bit here. And then we'll be creating some JSP pages in Eclipse. And then we'll learn the three different constructs of JSP. That's the scriptlets. You hear the word let a lot, like scriptlet, servlet. And when we learn JSF next time, we'll also have there's another term called facelet. So there's another let thing. And we'll also explore the expressions and also declarations, so how you can create variables and methods in JSP. And then I'll also show you how to include files in JSP. This is very similar to how you would do in PHP. So you have other HTML pages you can include into the JSP file. So that will be really handy. And also how you import Java classes into JSP. And this part here will be a really good transition for us to go to part two, which deals with Java Beans, and which is one of the main components of the MVC architecture. Okay, so just kind of give you prep for JSF, because JSF is it runs on the MVC framework. So, so in my notes, if you want to follow along, just look here. It's okay too. The screen's very small now. So I'm just going to reduce this just a little bit. All right, so this is again just a going to show you how you download Eclipse, which you already have. If you haven't, this will be the place to go and download that, or it's basically just update in the Eclipse. So right in here under part one, so JSP, okay, that's the acronym for Java Server Pages. And it is a scripting language that provides easy way for you to create web pages. So if you remember last week we created servlets, it was really difficult to create a web page, right? Because you have to write everything in the on the print statement. So you cannot just put HTML tags in your file. You have to output it to the response object, and then you would write it through the print writer to display a web page. So that was really tedious work. So what JSP is, the JSP is another layer that sits on top of the servlets. So it still relies on the servlet. You cannot write JSP without the servlet. Okay, so you still need that component. So it just makes it a little bit easier for us to write web applications. So JSP will be very similar to PHP. I would say that's at the same level, because you are now embedding JSP codes or Java code inside a web document, right? So same thing with PHP. As you remember, I mentioned that right down here, the distinctions between the Java servlet, this is called pure Java servlet, okay, because everything is on Java code, right? There's no HTML code in there. You don't have any of those tags in there. It's just all Java. But because of the web container, which is Tomcat, it makes it available for us, or for the server, to generate web pages. So the difference between the two is that you actually embed HTML in the Java code, right? That's for the servlet. So again, that's the that print line, and then you put HTML code in there. And for JSP, it's pretty much kind of the opposite of that. You encapsulate, or you embed Java code inside HTML, and that makes it really, really easy for web developers. This is the same way how you would embed JavaScript inside HTML document, and also with PHP, right? So you just put the HTML tags in there. You kind of mix them together in the same file. So that is the main difference. So again, just to reiterate, servlets are basically just Java classes, right? And the purpose of that is just to build web applications, okay? And it's kind of saying that servlets are suited for, service-oriented applications. So web services where you don't have a lot of GUI interface and so on. So you can create a web application that deals with, how would I say this? Use a lot of the web services, web sockets, all those stuff. And so it usually handles most of the non-textual data, right? The JSP is a text-based. As you can see, it's a text-based, so therefore it's more like a scripting language. That means that when you make changes to your JSP files, if we'll talk about this in a bit here, it does not need to go through the server engine to compile, recompile again to run. It would just parse it directly, render directly right on the server. So you have a really fast web application, so web rendition. And so that is the difference between the two. So here is the IDE. We got that already. I'll look at this again. Okay, we saw this last week. This is the. Let me do this. I can have a. This is called a one-tier. This is a one-tier architecture. This is an example of that. Okay, so you hear the word one-tier, two-tier, three-tier, n-tier. It refers to the. So in this case, it would be the client and the server. So for example, we're talking about static web pages like HTML pages, images and those graphics that on the server does not deal with any dynamic content. So we're dealing with just like the client side mostly. So that will be considered as a one tier, okay? And then when you start doing some dynamic web content, like JSP or servlets or PHP or ASP.NET, then now you're dealing with a two-tier. So two-tier is you are actually generating pages on the server side, and you also sending those responses back to the client side. So you're doing a two-tier architecture here. And then we have the three-tier, which is the so when you think of a three-tier, you were thinking about the web server, the client, web server, plus the database. So you have three different layers of components here that work together. Okay, so a three-tier would be something like that. And of course, there are four-tier and there are n tiers of architecture as well, which gets complicated. But so if you think about these web applications, especially in Java here, you are mostly dealing with a three-tier type of architecture because we also deal with database, right? So eventually, once you know how to create dynamic web pages, then you want to also store data and retrieve data and so forth from a database or a text file. So now you're dealing with another tier, which is the data tier. But if you look at this, which looks very similar to the diagram we saw earlier, is that we have the client side here, right? So the green diagram color is the server, the web server itself, which is Apache, right? If you run on Apache, or if you run on a different environment, it will be a different server, but ideally this will be like Apache server. And then within Apache server, you have like Tomcat, okay, which is a helper application, or it's just basically another server that is responsible for rendering or communicating with Java Servlet, JSP and JSF, and those other technologies to build dynamic content. So when you send a request from the client, which is again the browser, to the web server, okay, so if that request is just a plain static HTML file, then the server just basically sends it back to the client because it's there, if it's there. If it's requesting for a dynamic web page, like a .jsp or servlet or let's say PHP, then it needs a separate application to help to render that request. And so in terms of Java Servlet, that it needs to, the web container, which is Tomcat or Glassfish, one of those, is responsible for generating or requesting the servlet or JSP to build that site or build that application or whatever that content or the request may be. And the web container is responsible for communicating with the web server, right? So the web server, Apache, would send a request, which is now no longer a HTTP request. It will be a HTTP servlet request. So it's a little bit different. It converts it into its own type of object so it can understand, and we send that over to the servlet, and then the server will then know what to do with that, right? So it will process it. If it's requesting some data, it will get the data from a database or from other resources, and it will process that, and then of course, and it will send it back as a response. It will be of the type HTTP servlet response. This is something that the web browser does not understand. So again, that will be sent over to Tomcat. Tomcat send that over to the web server. It will convert it to HTTP response type. Again, this is just, for example, be just plain HTML text files, and then send that to the browser so the browser can render that and the user can see it. Okay, so it goes through this whole cycle here. So that's how you see that if it's a static file, it will be really fast. Just go through through the green box here. It just renders that or receives a request, sends that page back, and then it's really fast. But if the request is for a dynamic content, then it needs to go through the whole process here. And if it deals with data, then you can see that it takes a long process to get through back to the browser. Okay, so this is a pretty standard typical web application schematic of how things work on this server. All right, and here is another diagram going to show you the different layers of the Java web application technologies in the JVM. So we have the servlet down here. As you can see, it's a much lower layer. That's why it deals with a lot more of the Java code. So everything has to be coded in Java to display or render on the web page. And then we have the JSP pages that sits on top of that servlet, and it has its own syntax. It has its own. We'll see that in a bit here. Some of its own language constructs to build to write code, but the underlying code is still Java. It should still be the same Java as used in the servlet. So now the JSP here makes it much simpler and easier for developers to write or build pages, because you can embed both Java code and HTML code together. So anything that is not dynamically generated should be in HTML, and otherwise it should be in Java code, right? So it makes it much easier for developers. And then on top of that, you have another layer called the Java Server Pages Standard Tag Library, or a short acronym would be like JSTL. And this is a way of how you can actually create your custom tag in JSP also to write codes. Okay, well, let's see if you have time to explore. I'm not sure we do, but if you're interested in learning JSP and more in depth, this is something that you'll probably want to learn as well. JSTL is really powerful in terms of creating your own tags, kind of like AngularJS also. JSF also allows you to do that too. A little bit different, but it's also doable. And then on the right side of that, you see Java server faces, and this is another topic that we'll explore in the next 2 weeks. Okay, so as you can see, they both rely on the Java servlet. So you cannot have JSF or JSP without the servlet. Okay, so what that means is that if you write Java server faces or JSP pages, they need to be rendered down or translated back to servlet, and then needs to compile to the class or the bytecode in order for the JVM to interact with it, right? To talk about, to translate it or to run it. So you can see there's an overhead cost here going from the top down to lower layers. It's kind of like you have a high level language versus a low level language. It needs to compile or translate back to the lower level language. So what that means is every code you write in JSP, both HTML tags and Java code, need to be translated back to Servlet. So it'll be another just a Java file, and the Servlet that will be done automatically for you. You don't do that, and then from there on, it will be just it'll be treated just like a regular Servlet. It needs to be compiled and then run on the server. Okay, so here is the lifecycle we saw last time about for the Servlet, right? So the Servlet loads. It will create an instance of that Servlet, and then it will call the init method, right? The init, we tested that last week. So the initialization method here is only executed one time when you run the Servlet, and then it will go into the service method. It will call the service method here, and this is where you have the request and response taking place. So if you make some changes to your web page, or if you reload your form or resubmit the form, it will just basically go through this cycle here, okay, until you terminate that Servlet, and then it will be destroyed. Okay, so the life cycle is very similar to JSF. If you look at this, it's almost exactly the same, except you have a different method name. It's called JSP init instead of just init for initialization. This also gets executed one time only. And then we have the JSP service. There's an underscore in front of it as well. And very similar to the service method. And of course you have the JSP destroy as well. So again, the request and response process will still be occurring here in the service method here. So when you refresh your pages, make changes and so on, it will be just running in this part of the life cycle. Okay, so very similar. And there's another notes here to kind of explain what's going on in that life cycle. So when a JSP is run on the server, it must be processed by the web server, okay? And then the web server must support JSP. That means it needs to have that helper application, which is a Tomcat server, right? To render that page. And then it will be stored inside the server as a .jsp file. So you have to name it with the .jsp in order for that server to understand to send that to which engine. Because you could have, JSP along with PHP on the same machine, the same Apache server, right? So if you named it wrong, then it's going to call the wrong component. So if you happen to just rename your file to .php, that you may think that it's a PHP file, and because of that, it will not work. So just make sure it has the .jsp extension. So the server will translate the .jsp to a servlet, right? So the .jsp basically will be converted to a servlet. Again, servlet is the .java file, right? So you have the .jsp converts to .java and then compiles it into a .class. So you have like 3 layers down. And then the .class is the bytecode so that Java can actually execute those files. So if you look at this diagram here, again, kind of similar. From the browser, sends a request to the web server. if it's a .jsp file, so the server will send that to Tomcat. Tomcat will initialize a request to have that file to be rendered or run. And then it's a .jsp file. It needs to be translated by a translator and translates that into the servlet. Okay, and so so .jsp will become .java, and then from there it will be compiled into the .class. So you have like 3 steps here, and then once that's been generated as a .class, then it will just run and send a response back to the web server, and then the web server translate that into a HTTP response, sends back to the browser. Okay, so you go through this cycle here. And then next time it comes around, if it look at the same JSP file, if it's the same JSP file, then it knows that if there is already an existing .class file on that same file, and if it will compare actually the actual existing file, the .class file, if there's no changes in that file, then it does not need to go through this whole cycle again. Okay, and so it will save you a lot of time. It will only render or recompile your code if you make changes to your servlet file. If you don't, then it would just run the JSP, process it really quick, and send it back. So you have like, the same scenario as a scripting language. It does not need to recompile. But the first time around, it will compile. Okay, it will go through the whole process, compiles it, saves it in the .class file. It keeps a copy of it, and every time when you execute that same JSP file, it checks for that .class file to see if things has been changed. If it does, then it will recompile that file.
It's saved in the cache?
Not in the cache. It will save it in the actual file. It will actually generate a .class file on the server, and it keeps track of that file, and because it needs that to execute. So every time, if you make changes to the original, let's say .java file or the servlet, then it will recompile the whole file again, and it will replace the current one with the existing one.
How does the browser know?
Yeah, the browser doesn't know. It's all on the server. So this is typically like if you let's just say you rewrite the code, and you make some changes into your code and you upload it to the server. That's only the time when you make changes to your code, right? So if you do that, then that file has been changed. So therefore, the next time you run on the browser, it will recompile your code again. Once it's compiled, it will stay on the server as is. Okay. So, and that's a good thing because it saves you a lot of time. I mean, imagine you have to recompile this whole thing every time. That's a lot of files a lot of resources to do that. So it will actually slow down the process. But because it only does it once, then it doesn't do any compilation anymore, and so that would be much faster for the server. So JSP files are actually really fast if you compare that to like PHP and others. Okay. And here I just say that to ensure that the first time real user does not encounter a delay. So that delay is the compilation process. So developers should actually test the page to make sure it works after you install it. So that means when you make changes to your file, you upload to the server, you run it once. You run it once, it compiles it, it keeps a copy of that file in there, so next time when a user comes to the page, they don't have to recompile the whole process. So it doesn't cause that delay. Okay? So that's what this means. All right, so here is another illustration to show you the life cycle of JSP. So the JSP comes in here, go to translator, translate that .jsp file to the .java file, okay, which is a servlet, right? And then it needs to compile to the .class file, and then now it can be executed by the JRE, which is on the JVM, and then it would send back to the browser. And so next time when you, it doesn't show the whole process here, but when you run the file again, it will actually check for that last modification date of that .class file, see if it's if it's updated. If it's not, it will just keep that, and it will go into what's called a dynamic content generation, which is basically just it will just parse the JSP file and process that directly on the server, so it's much quicker that way. So it's kind of similar diagram here. So during the translation and the compilation process, just going to show you what happens during that time. We'll be talking about some of the directives. This is just some very useful controls of how you can force or how should I say this? just some special directives, special keywords that you will apply to a web page, to your JSP page, so that the engine knows how to basically translate that that page. This would be like, for example, when you want to include any of the import any class, import any, or include any other files, any other custom tags and so on. So you put that in the directives here. And we'll see some examples later. The scripting elements, this is the scripting language, we'll see that in a bit. And also the expression language, which allows you to write expressions. And we'll deal with this later. These are part of the Java Bean, so we'll do this one here next week. And also the custom tags. Okay, so let's see if we can create a JSP project and kind of see the whole thing in perspective. So once we create this project here, we'll do that in a minute here. I just want to show you down here at the bottom a diagram kind of. I think we looked at this last week already. Somewhere down here. Just basically the structure. Okay, so there's the web module structure. If you recall, we look at this a little bit different. I mean, it's a different file last time, but it looks kind of similar here. So the root, assembly root here is actually the root of your directory, which is the landing page or the root of your home page, okay, on any website. And then on there you have a folder called web-inf, which is just basically web information here. And on the same level here you have where you list all your JSP files, right? Any HTML file, any CSS, images, graphics, or any other scripts you put at that root level here. And then on the server itself, which is on Tomcat server, and that's what it means. We don't. I mean, you will not generate this. It will be contained and maintained by Tomcat. You have a web-inf file, and there you have all the libraries, other classes that you write. So, for example, if you write a JSP file or a .java file, it needs to be compiled. Once it's compiled, it will be put inside this classes here, and that's where all your classes are stored. And you have your custom tags as well. Okay, so just kind of understand this diagram here to see what things are. Okay, I have another example to see here. So maybe this is a little bit clearer because it looks kind of similar to this, right? So you have the web app or the web content folder, and then in that is the root directory. Inside there you have actually two directories called, one is web-inf, one is called the web, the meta and information, meta tags. Okay, and then inside that will be again classes and other files. Some of these will be automatically generated by the server. Some you can actually create it yourself. Okay, and then and the root directory here is your JSP files, your other resources like HTML and so on. So if you add a directory called images, you put your images in here, it will be stored in this root directory here. Okay, so if you look at this example that I put here, is what you will see inside Eclipse in a bit here. So you have the web content. The web content folder is the root directory of your web page, your website. Okay, so inside I could create a folder called include, and then I put my include files in that directory. If I want to create another directory for CSS, I'll put that in there in the web content, or anywhere else. It doesn't really matter as long as you know where it is. You just make sure you link it to that location. So these two, the meta and the web folders are here. Just don't delete them. And if you were to create a JSP file, it will be in the web content folder. So here's the hello.jsp file. If you run that on the browser, it will look like this in the URL. So again, this is running localhost on the port 8080. This is a default port for Tomcat. Okay, you can change this port to something else if you want, but the default is 8080. And then, as you can see, this slash here points right into the web content folder. Okay. Well, actually, a bit different here. It goes into the project folder here. and then the hello will be this file, and then from here on, so this is I think this is probably what the root of your directory is. From here on, you have, so if you want to access the header file, it would have like slash and then include and then slash header.html. Okay, just kind of give you a perspective of what things are like something that you probably are familiar with when you build web applications or web pages. Okay, so then let's go and create a Jsp application. It will be very similar to how you create your servlets, the same way. Okay, so let's create one. I'm going to create a new project. Well, I'm just going to stop the video here.